In this movie, we'll add some columns to our building layout. Revit has two different kinds of columns that we can use. There's architectural columns and there are structural columns, and we'll look at both of them in this movie. An architectural column is sort of a simple version of a column. You can use either or in your projects, but I actually like to use both. I like to use the architectural columns as the column enclosure, sort of the finished material like the drywall or whatever else might be wrapping around the structure. And then, of course, I use the structural column for the actual structural material, the steel or the concrete that's actually holding up the building. So I'm going to start with the architectural columns. Now, both of them can be accessed from this drop-down button right here. And here is my column architectural. So I'll go ahead and choose that. You'll see a small little rectangle appear on my cursor, and that's because we're using the rectangular column family here, and it has three sizes. Now I'm going to choose the largest size, which is a 610 millimeter square column. And you could place it anywhere on screen. And so if I just placed it out there in space, I would have a completely freestanding column. But if you actually place the column at one of the intersections of the grids, take a look over at the Properties palette, and you'll notice that under Constraints, there's a setting called Moves with Grids, and it's checked on right now. Now, what that means is when you place these columns at a grid intersection, the position will stay associated with that grid intersection. So let me demonstrate that here. I'm going to click right at this intersection between column line 3.7 and B. I'll click the Modify tool to cancel the command, and now I'm going to select column line B. Now, if I drag it a little bit, notice that it takes the column with it. And the same would happen if I took 3.7 and moved it, that the column will move with it. So this is a nice handy way to keep all your columns associated with the grids. And if you later move those grids, it will adjust. Now, I don't want to keep any of those changes, so I'm going to undo that. Now, I could do Control Z a few times, or I could click this button a few times. But if you notice next to the undo button, there's actually a drop-down menu, and it will keep track of all the commands that you've been running throughout this Revit session. So I just did two drag operations and placed a column. And in fact, I placed two columns, and I don't really need this one out here. So I'm going to drag through all four of these options and click, and notice that it will undo them all in a single step. Now, when you undo multiple commands, if you go too far, you actually have a drop down on the redo command as well that would allow you to redo the commands that you've undone. Using both undo and redo can be a quick and easy way for you to kind of reverse some of those operations. Now let me go back to the architectural column command. It should remember that I was using a 610 millimeter square column, and this time I'm going to place it at the intersection between grid lines A and 4. Now when I click, I'm going to go ahead and do a zoom in window here. Notice that another interesting feature of columns becomes evident. Now, this is a feature of architectural columns. It will actually merge into the surrounding wall geometry. So if I drag over here a little bit and do it again with this intersection, and over here at this intersection, notice that it's merging in with all of these walls. Now, I'm going to go ahead and zoom back out and place the remaining columns just along the perimeter of the building. Now I'm going to skip these internal intersections here because I'm going to put structural columns in those locations. So I'm going to go ahead and click the Modify tool here to cancel. So I now have my architectural columns at all of those locations. And again, keep in mind that if you were to move one of these grid lines, it will move all of the columns that are associated with that grid line. I'll do Control Z to undo that. So let's move on to structural columns next. So I'm going to come over here to the drop down and I'm going to choose structural column. Now, it is possible for us to load other families into the project file. So we could load in concrete column families, or we could load in other shapes of steel families. The default template here includes just a single steel shape listed here under universal columns. So for this example, I'm just going to use that steel shape that's already loaded in the file because we're going to talk about loading families in a future movie. So this works almost the same way as the architectural column. You could place it freestanding. It also has the Moves with Grids feature on the Properties palette. So if you click on a grid, it will associate with that grid. And then there are several additional settings here that are more structurally related. I want to show you the little gotcha that kind of gets me every time I use structural columns. Without looking at all the settings, I sometimes forget to look, and I'll click a point to locate my column, and then I'll get this warning message that appears down at the bottom of the screen. And it's telling me that none of the elements that I've created are visible in the current view. And you're left kind of wondering why and what happened. Well, let's go ahead and click the Modify tool to cancel out of there. and I'm going to open up the south elevation to investigate. And what you'll see is there is my column right there. So when you're working with a structural column, it's following the rules that structural engineers use instead of the rules that architectural engineers use. And typically structural engineers like to start at the top of the building and work down. So because loads go down with gravity. So anyway, the column goes in the negative direction. So in this case, I'm going to actually delete that one. I'll go back to my floor plan. And if you want to think more architecturally about placing these columns, then what you want to do is this. Go to structural column. And again, I'm going to keep the default type here. But notice here on the options bar, you have a choice between either depth or height. So if you don't want to set it relative to depth, you want to choose height. And then in this case, I'll set the height to go up to level 2 and then begin placing my columns. Now, instead of placing the columns individually, I'm actually going to take advantage of a unique feature that structural columns have. If you look at the ribbon, notice that there's a multiple panel and it has two options, at grids and at columns. So the at columns option means that you'll be able to place a structural column at the location of any architectural columns. And that's why I placed the architectural columns first. Now, what I'm going to do is start over here on the left-hand side of my plan and drag a box selection surrounding my entire floor plan. Now, notice when I do that, it's only highlighting the columns because this command has a built-in filter that says place a structural column at each of the locations of the architectural columns. To finish this and accept this operation, I just click this green finish checkbox right here on the ribbon, and that will place a piece of steel at each location of the structural columns. The at grids option is similar, except that it will now place a piece of steel at the intersection of column grids that you select. So I'm going to make a crossing selection this time in this location here, and notice that it will highlight any intersections that occur where I want to place a piece of steel. And once again, if I click the finish button, it will create those pieces of steel at those intersections. Now I'm going to cancel out of the command and I'm going to show you one last thing. I'm going to zoom in slightly here, and structural columns obviously have an orientation. Our architectural columns, it didn't matter because they're square. But if I select these columns here, let's say along grid line B, maybe I want those to be oriented the other way. Well, the easiest way to do that in Revit is to simply tap your space bar, and that will take those objects and it will rotate them 90 degrees, and they're now oriented the other way. So when you're ready to start adding columns in your Revit projects, you have two choices, and you could do only structural columns or you could do only architectural columns. But I like to do both because, as you can see, I think they have unique features and they both serve your model well. So I'm using my structural columns to represent the actual steel that's holding up my building, and I'm using my architectural columns as a column wrap enclosure going around those pieces of steel.